Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Gilles. I'm the editor of Real Deals, and welcome to this webinar. With a growing number of assets under management, and as GPs adjust to the new normal post-COVID, a significant number of firms, particularly when it comes to mid-sized managers, said enhancing back-office processes and technology is a strategic priority. Managers are reviewing their current operating models to find efficiency gains, control rising costs, and to be more responsive to deeper investor and regulatory scrutiny. And during this webinar, our expert panel will discuss how and why PE firms are turning to trusted partners and providers to fulfill their growth ambitions. So without further ado, I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists who can then tell you a little bit more about themselves. And I'm going to start with Lance Taylor, a partner and CFO at GGC, and we've got Kartik Shah from Apex Group, Global Co-Head of Private Equity Product, and Jeff Cook, who's a Chair and Non-Executive Director from Jeff Cook Advisory. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. And can I please ask you to introduce yourselves? Lance, do you want to tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Greg. So as Greg mentioned, I'm a partner and the CFO of HGGC. We're a middle market private equity firm based on the West Coast of the United States, and we're across a variety of industries and really kind of focus in on what we used to call the old school private equity. So pretty hands-on approach, very partnership driven, and we're in the trenches with our portfolio companies getting things done. So we're happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Lance. Kartik, do you want to go next?
Hi everyone, my name is Kartik Shah, and I'm, as Greg said, I'm a global co-head of private equity product here at Apex Group. And I guess Apex Group is a single source fund solutions provider, providing services across the entire value chain, covering a global client base, really through the traditional fund administration, corporate services, and more recently through our financial services arm, where we have a bank in the business, so we can provide banking services, custody, and full scope depository services. I've been at Apex for just over 4 years, and really my role is to make sure that our clients are serviced on the right technology with the right products, and we're always looking to enhance the product set that we can provide managers outside the core services I think that traditional administrators would provide. And more recently, sort of looking at our operating models and making sure we can provide a seamless integration, more connected into our clients' own back office and acting like an extension of their own team. So look forward to being here. Thank you, Greg.
And Jeff.
Hi, Greg. Thank you for the welcome. So by background, I'm a banker, 20 years with HSBC. Last role I had there was running their wealth management division in the UK. After that, I represented Jersey as an international finance centre for about a dozen years, running representative body here. And these days, I'm a non-executive chair and director of a number of companies, which include Capvis, which is Switzerland's leading private equity firm. And I'm a non-executive director of Apex Jersey. So very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So as I alluded to earlier, there's absolutely no doubt that PE today operates in a much different environment than it did in 2021, let alone 5 or 6 years ago. If we were to start with the most recent and more pressing challenges, but perhaps also the opportunities that you see as a result of this this change in landscape, could you please give us your take on the state of the PE market at the moment, and sort of paint the scene for our audience there? I don't know who wants to start with very lofty questions.
I'm happy to have a go if colleagues are content.
Please
so
do.
Yeah, so it's hard to think of a time, I think, when we've had this level of really an unprecedented convergence of challenges and risks, macro risks, really. I mean, PE spends so much of its time focusing on micro situations, looking at individual deals, individual companies, assessing the risks of entering, a deal with a particular company. I think it's rare in the last decade or two we've had the number of macro risks to consider as well. So we've had, it's hard to think of a time where we've had a global financial crisis, a pandemic, and a major war in Europe all in a 10, 12 year period. It's quite remarkable when you think about it historically. From where I'm sitting, that's exacerbated inflationary trends that were currently already underway in the US. That's led to food and energy insecurity, particularly in Europe. And I think PE firms are in a position of having to consider, or at least they've been proactive, considering sort of what I would call no regret actions. So protecting the balance sheet, conserving cash, perhaps revisiting borrowing covenants, looking hard at their cost base of their portfolio companies, how they're going to staff them, how they're going to recruit, and how they can take advantage of automation, workflow technology, those sorts of things. So I think it's always a busy time in private equity, but it's absolutely a very, very intense focus at the moment, I would say. I think the era of cheap debt's over. I don't think we're going to see that back for any time soon. That's creating a degree of uncertainty around, I think, valuations, and I think it's also probably slowed fundraising for a time anyway. And I think buyers will be looking to reappraise target prices currently. Vendors are still looking to crystallize recent gains and understandably don't want to give up on the strong valuations of recent years. So inevitably, I think for a time, deal count's going to slow. IPOs and SPACs seem to be off the agenda at the moment anyway. But I would still be quite buoyant about the prospects for PE, even though we're facing probably a recession, an Atlantic recession, both in the US and in Europe. We don't know how long it'll be. Will it be 2 quarters? Will it be 4? Don't really know. But there's such a lot of committed and uncalled capital in the industry. I think according to Bain, it's still over $3 trillion. So I think there are many years left of investment that have been raised. So I think we can weather the storm. And if you look back, I've been looking at it recently in terms of vintage years for private equity. The years following a recession, a couple of years usually have to turn out generally to be very good investment years. So I think straightening the decks, getting ship shape, and then looking for opportunity as matters unfold is how I see the situation.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll get into the sort of the operational implications and how PE firms deal with that. But I could see Lance of nodding and approving. Does that with your?
No, Jeff was pretty comprehensive there. I think it was very good thoughts. I think the one thing I'd mention is that by and large, most of our investment professionals have never been in this type of environment. They don't have as many gray hairs as we do. So think about a recession, inflationary environment, and challenges to the overall markets. It's new territory. And so you have to be able to step back and revisit history and what you've learned before, how you've acted before, how you get through this, as Jeff pointed out, because you can still find pockets of opportunity, and there is a lot of capital on the sidelines. You need to use that capital proactively and conservatively to still meet your investment objectives and drive returns for your investors. But I think Jeff summed up kind of the overall issues that we're all facing pretty well.
Yeah, and anything else that we've missed there, Kartik, based on obviously you're exposed to a range of clients, range of strategies. What's the feedback that you get from the market at the moment?
Yeah, the few things we're seeing with our client base, I think one of the key areas is private equity, or this asset class. It's got flexibility in its own right, and what I mean by that is managers don't need to sell. Yeah, so I agree. It's the wider political, the regulatory, raising interest rates, inflation. We are seeing, with our client base, a slowdown in transaction volume. Certainly from Q1 this year. And that's going to remain, I think, a bit more subdued than the recent, years. But what that means is that private equity managers, they don't need to sell. They can hold on, and the last few years have been record numbers of distributions, realizations at record prices. So I think that inherent flexibility they have means they can ride the storm. I think Jeff, raised a good point. The years after a recession, its returns are significantly higher, and these managers are not forced sellers, and that's what we're seeing. I think the other thing we're seeing is, to the point that there's no liquidity shortage, but what we're seeing is a lot more follow-on, add-on portfolio bolt-ons to the existing companies. And again, you have to think a lot of these managers have bought, assets at high multiples, so they have to add value and they have to keep adding value. So they need to sort of spend more time managing the portfolio, but also, how can they enhance the portfolio with acquisitions? And so we're seeing a lot more of that. And then I guess the last piece, and I think this was, last year, we saw the rise of the continuation or secondaries funds. And I think this year, secondaries will again, become more popular as a way of giving investors, your investor-based liquidity, but allowing managers to, keep their crown jewels, not forced to sell them. So I think that's what we'll see, the increased use of those continuation vehicles.
So yeah, obviously, whether it's the latest sort of challenges that have arisen with inflation and regulation, we'll come back to that in a minute, I'm sure. But even sort of going back before that, there's certainly been a big push for more kind of hands-on value creation strategies and just helping portfolio companies. And you've all referred to that kind of, helping portfolio companies and helping the portfolio. What have been the implications that you've seen in terms of monitoring the portfolio, reporting, but making sure that the team internally within a GP remains focused and is able to implement the right valuation, the right value creation strategy? Lance, what's your experience on the ground as a GP there?
There's a lot to unpack in that, but I'd point maybe a couple of things that we've done over time, right? And I think many private equity firms have. We have a dedicated debt capital markets team, right? So you think about the debt markets and the impact during this environment, the capital structure of our portfolio companies, that you add a lot of value just by having an in-house individual, that takes care of that, has relationships with banks and works closely with the portfolio companies to manage the cap tables. And like many other private firms, we've established an operating partner group, as we call it, operational resource group. So they're also kind of built to help drive value at the company. But, as a GP, how do you kind of manage those things? We'll have really kind of a scorecard that's put together on the debt market, the capital structures of our businesses, and kind of, your red, yellow, green type of indication. We've done the same thing now on the just kind of the forecast side of our portfolio companies, where as we head into this environment that we're in, what does the next 12 months look like? Where do we have risks? Where are things that we need to spend more time? And how do we add value during that time period? And so I think we've created some dashboards and some reporting that's accountable to each of the deal teams on how their companies are doing, the health of the company, where are they seeing the pressures, and then what does a forecast look like, and what are we going to do about kind of those areas, and try to really focus in on where we can have the most value and have the biggest impact on the companies to ensure that they survive and thrive during these times. A lot of times you can help your companies win during these type of environments and come out stronger on the back end. So kind of that's the focus that we would have with our current portfolio.
And Kelsey, what's your take on this from a service provider point of view? What have been the sort of the big drivers for you to come in and help your clients, or other types of service providers like that, as operations get more kind of, as Lance just said, which is way more in depth and more specialized? What's been your contribution there?
Yeah, and I think as Lance said, as these managers are sort of doing their forecasting, scenario planning, understanding, how the inflation and rising interest rates will affect their portfolio, how can they sort of, operationally support their portfolio? One area and the area that we're getting pressure from is access to data. Portfolio managers, they need access to data quicker now. Real time, or almost real time. They need to be able to run their own analytics to that data, update current with forecast, and therefore, I think I made the point about embedding our services into a portfolio manager's processes, and that's what we're really seeing becoming an extension. And I think that's where the trend is going. Managers want to be able to, have at the touch of a button their data, be able to sort of run their own dashboards, run their own sort of risk metrics around that. But it goes one step further as well. So, LPs are becoming more demanding as well. So it's not just at the portfolio level, but it's at the fund level. So performance data, how can you provide that? Really show your investors that you're on top of the data. You're managing the portfolio in the most effective manner and trying to extract the most value. And data is the big key here. It's the big enabler. And that's where we're seeing, and we are one of the initiatives we're looking at is data as a service. So all of a sudden, you're not just talking about the core traditional fund administration for managing the capital calls, and the investment side of it. How do you help coordinate a manager's entire data journey? Can you support them if they're working with multiple suppliers, vendors? Can you consolidate that data and give it back to them in a format that's useful to them?
Now, I know this is about third-party service providers helping us with this, right? And I don't want to, it's not an Apex commercial necessarily, Kartik, but we are using some of those services, right? So we do have a dedicated team with Apex that's helping collect portfolio data in a system to help manage that data in a way that can be more consumable for us. And I know we'll talk a little bit later, but the additional kind of lens and services that they're asking about and providing to us is around ESG, right? And actually getting into more of the data, because he talked about there's a lot of data you want to track and have information on, but it's definitely data that our limited partners are asking for. And so having a partner who can help think alongside us and provide some of those data solutions, because when I step back, right, one of the reasons that we went to a third-party resource for fund admin was their focus on technology and the ability for them to provide solutions so that I'm not spending all of my time in an IT world and putting the firm resources to that effort where there's others who have expertise and more resources to bring to bear in that regard. So it is very valuable to have outside resources that can help leverage thinking and technology to drive data analysis and decisions.
And Lance, just to that point, some managers, like the larger managers, will have their own in-house systems as well. So I think just as an industry, it's about integration. Yeah, it's about how any service provider, any third-party vendor, takes their data but integrates that back to a manager's data point. And I think that's a growing trend in the industry.
And Jeff, what's your take on this? You mentioned earlier you've obviously worked with very different kind of private equity businesses over the years, and you've seen that kind of evolution. Is that something that hits? And Kartik's point about kind of how the size of managers is something that I was interested in, and I know we talked about it the other day. Do you still come across firms that are now too big and it's like, oh, that's fine, we can do everything, we can do all that in house, we don't need kind of any help managing that? Or on the converse, smaller firms are, it's not for us, we haven't got the means to do that. In other words, is it becoming a lot more kind of tailored and a lot more widely adopted within the industry?
I'm not sure that sort of that kind of general view is as applicable as it once was, because the sheer complexity of the world that private equity groups are operating in, and the focus on them from so many quarters, the LP lens around responsible investment, sustainability, ESG, the internalization of things like diversity and inclusion, the need to be very focused, and this will become increasingly so, I think, in a situation where maybe recruitment's tight, it's hard to find enough of the right kind of people. And you want them focused at a time like this, I would say, you want people to learn how to operate in an inflationary environment. So even the biggest firms, anybody that's joined those firms over the last 10, 15 years have got probably no experience of operating in a structurally inflationary environment. So, those folks are going to need to be very, very focused on their portfolio companies. And then beyond them, their wider suppliers. I imagine they'll be doing scenario planning, supply dependency, balance sheets, debt, cash flow, looking at cycle exposure. I think will be quite important, which ones will fare reasonably okay in a recessionary environment, which might come under strain. I think in that respect, banking relationships are critical. Are they exploring NAV facilities, backup lines of credit? At the moment, the wider economy, is not terribly troubling, but credit and equity markets are kind of a little bit all over the place, and one expects the wider economy is going to be impacted in time. Another thing I don't think, even the biggest groups don't want to lose focus on at a time like this is the focus on targets. The relationship building with targets is a long-term thing. So if someone's going to do a deal this year and this coming year, 2023, that have been talking to that target for a long time. And whilst you need to be sensitive about it, they may be a very better value. There might be a price re-rating on the table, depending on the depth and nature of the recessionary environment, how much those targets might be affected. But I do agree with Lance and with Kartik that it all boils down to the need for really, really good data. And I think what's happened is it's now required in so many more areas than it used to be. It's not just about the portfolio companies, how they're getting on, and you're getting your valuation information back flexibly when you need to. It's in so many other areas now, and I think one of the biggest growth areas is the focus on regulatory returns and compliance, because at a time like this, regulators will be on a heightened alert. They're no different to commercial firms. They see the disruption in the markets, they see new stresses and pressures coming through, and I think in the US and the EU particularly, if you look at the US, this big focus now on antitrust, and the FTC and the SEC coming out with requiring greater disclosure, both on individual deals and on exits. This worry about what they call it in the US, we call it market consolidation in Europe, but this worry about roll up, and concentration of power in too small hands that's been articulated. All those sorts of things, you need a terrific evidence base to make sure that your reporting is got all the evidence in it, it's timely, you meet reporting deadlines, and you're anticipating what regulators might want from you next. So you would have to be quite big and brave to feel you could actually internalize all of that, no matter how big you are as a PE group. Because I do think the world we operate in, while still very attractive with lots and lots of positive prospects, is getting ever more complicated.
Lance, how does that tie in with what you, especially when it comes to the sort of the regulatory environment and how you have to prepare for that, sort of be ahead of that? Is that something that you've had to undertake in-house, and with the help of your service providers?
Yeah, no, the environment's definitely becoming more complex, and we're not a small fund. We're just under 7 billion. So there's a lot of things you can try to do in-house, and then a lot of things where you need expertise on the outside to help you to get to where you need to go, right? So no, I think it's interesting because we put a lot of resources around our own regulatory type compliance. We've been registered in the US since we started the firm back in 2008, which was before the old Dodd-Frank and the changes in the regulatory environment in the US. And so, that's helped, I think, quite a bit to have a firm that was built on a compliance culture to begin with. But as things come out and these new marketing rules are rolling out from the SEC, you need some, expertise externally to help you navigate those environments properly and make sure that you're in compliance. I think the pressures from LPs around ESG, I think our own goals and initiatives around diversity, equity, inclusion, all of those things just put some additional strain on the system and focus on areas that maybe traditionally we hadn't put a lot of resource to. You could argue whether we should have, but it's something that's on top of our minds now moving forward. And you need to be able to navigate that efficiently, right? I mean, and so part of that is evaluating the resources you have in house. Maybe what ones you actually are critical to add, and then does someone like an Apex or someone else provide you the expertise and the talent that you can acquire yourself to get those things done? And so I think it's an ongoing partnership with your service providers to balance the complexities about what you should do in-house and what expertise you do have, and what you should be outsourcing and providing, getting leverage from others. So I think and our war on talent, if you want to call it, to try to attract people is difficult. I don't think it's any easier for our service providers either. So I think you both have to be eyes wide open that this is an environment where you got to be able to, leverage systems and technology too, because finding the right people is not always easy to do.
Yeah, certainly. And Kartik, how have you been working with your clients in that particular area, and how receptive you found them to be to that sort of need for have perhaps greater scrutiny over their sort of regulatory requirements and all the data requirements that come with that? Oh, still on mute, Kartik.
So I think Lance captured it perfectly there. So managers are facing a lot more scrutiny, and they want to access markets quickly. They want to be compliant. They want to make sure that they're meeting the regulatory burden, but it's that expertise. And look, Lance made a good point. It's not just the service providers. It's the managers. It's everyone that's struggling to retain the talent or find the talent. And we utilize technology, and I think a lot of firms are utilizing technology to make sure that you're keeping abreast of changes in the regulatory landscape. And really, it's about having a global landscape. So we understand we've got global offices, so we can really monitor what's going on around the globe and pass that wisdom on to our clients. But really, we're facing the same difficulties here.
Well, let me just want to add in there, right? We raise capital from across the world, so having partners who have access and have expertise across different markets is extremely valuable for us as well.
And there's another area as well that you've touched on, similar that's driven both kind of value creation for the private firms that do it right, but also the massive requirement for handling data, for reporting, and it's ESG, which obviously is going to come to no surprise to anyone. But I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that, and how you've seen the industry kind of try to tackle that from an operational perspective, and especially when it comes to managing that data flow back all the way down from the portfolio company all the way back up to LPs. What's your view on the latest developments there?
Yeah, let me try to put it in context with, we started raising capital pretty heavily in Europe, 2014, 2015, and that was already a topic, right? Was ESG, how you thinking about it? And that's just kind of, obviously, the scrutiny and the level of information that is being demanded has gotten a lot more detailed since then. And you have to look at this from the lens of why are they asking the questions, and is this good business practice? And I think the answer is yes, right? This is not just, hey, I'm doing this because I have to report it to my limited partners. There's real value that you can create as you implement these processes and look through the lens of ESG and across all of the aspects of ESG. So it is about getting better at what we do and helping our companies run better and be more responsible. And so if you approach it from that standpoint, this adds value and creates better companies and is better overall for our investors. Then this becomes just a mission critical path. What information can we gather? What information is important to gather, and how does that then help reflect the efforts that we and our portfolio companies are putting in to be responsible across each of those metrics? And so, I think there are more public frameworks out there now. You got the Data Convergence Project from the ILPA, you got the UNPRI, other organizations where there are kind of, what do you call, standards out in the marketplace that are being expected that everyone, at least in some regard or another, follows. And so it's then taking that and drilling down through the layers to some degree as a private equity manager, because we're not in control of those day-to-day data all the time, and pulling out and providing and putting a system in place to gather what we need to be able to report out and also manage. And so it's not easy, right? And so there's a lot of steps in there, and there's a lot of detail and focus that needs to happen. And so I think but for me, it's stepping back and saying, why are we doing this? We have to be approaching it because it is good business practice, and we do think it adds value long term to our investors. So that's kind of my guiding star and how we approach the problem.
Is it still work in progress for us in terms of how you've built that framework, how you manage that flow of
Absolutely.
data? Is it just constantly improving, or?
Absolutely. I don't know if you'll ever necessarily be done with this, because there'll just be new requirements over time. So yeah. It's putting in place systems and processes to gather data that you need, and then when you need additional information and different data sets, that you've already got the piping put in place to allow you to do the reporting that you need to do.
Yeah. And Kartik, how do you manage that kind of, how do you help your clients manage that vast flow of data and trying to improve on that incrementally?
Yeah, look, one of the key areas for us is to keep on top of the way the market's moving. So we already got SFDR, and the level 2 reporting, which is due next year. That's going to give a bigger onus on managers to report even more information. And it's with any service provider, you need to work with them, to create that process, here we offer the full service. So it's the data collection, it's the validation, but more important for us, we see it as an independence play as well. So number one, we're alleviating the pressure from people like Lance and his team, understanding what exactly the data is required, and being able to push it back to the manager in the way they need. But secondly, it's about that independence, and I think with ESG there's a lot of labels around greenwashing. Just are people sort of investing into ESG businesses that really not ESG businesses? What's the real value add of sustainability points to those businesses, and having that independent, someone else checking and reviewing and verifying, it adds a bit of credibility to what managers are actually doing for investors.
Absolutely. And Jeff, on that point of greenwashing, or it's something that comes fairly often, but more generally the sort of the level at which it's properly embedded in private equity firms, as Lance said as well, making sure it's part of the mission. How have you approached that at the board level and from an advisory point of view?
Yeah, well, I think increasingly regulatory authorities, in my experience, and one of the other things I do is I chair something called Morant Consulting, which is a consulting arm of one of the biggest offshore law firms. And what we see is increasingly regulators taking an interest in what goes on around the board table in these areas, and to what degree they're discussed, and to what degree they're integrated into the business risk assessment that all firms are expected to have, and that boards are expected to take a direct interest in. So I think the ante's gone up from being a sort of not exactly aspirational, but trying to be responsible, trying to be a good corporate citizen, and to take things like the UNPRI and other principles seriously. Firms were sort of, I think, starting to move towards best efforts, and then starting to produce sustainability reports, those sorts of things. But then, of course, one or two have tripped up when they've had regulatory reviews and haven't quite been, or at least as far as the regulators are concerned, providing the evidence that they're actually doing what their aspiration was projecting. So now it's actually quite a serious regulatory risk. So having your evidence base, and understanding what you've committed to, and if you're going to publicize that and communicate that to your LPs and through various documents, more widely, you do need to be able to back it up. And I think that's where the data capture, data management is mission critical, to be honest. It's ESG health checks, measurements, ratings, databases. These are all tools you need now. You can't just sort of write it in your prospectus and say, we're ESG friendly. That won't cut the mustard. Climate related measures and KPIs that become increasingly important if you made any kind of commitment towards net zero. I think, and other areas you need now in terms of regulatory oversight, quite a newer one in Europe. I don't know how it's in the US, but foreign investment into sensitive industries. I'd imagine that would be a big thing in the US with the recent developments. So all of these things are they're not brand new, but they haven't been with us for that long. And I think our ability to project what we're doing, communicate what we're doing, but be able to back it up and proof it is really important if you want to kind of clear your regulatory supervisory visits in your regulatory hurdles. And perhaps one thing we haven't talked about that's key in that whole area is cyber. Massive quantities of sensitive data now that are being held. How secure is it? And can you transfer it? You know, can you give portal access? Can it be nice and easy to access for those that need to access it? But is it safe? So it is a complex world that we're living in. And I think increasingly, using service providers that are big enough to be able to see the market situation, be able to actually benchmark best practice, and have the deep enough pockets to develop the technology solutions to provide you with the frameworks, the measurement, the reporting, the data, the monitoring, is becoming more and more important.
Jeff made a really good point there. We've been speaking to managers over the last 2 years about ESG reporting, SFDR, and initially, a lot of managers, well, let's wait and see, or we're going to do this in-house. 12 months later, a lot of managers have not been able to, work out a solution. It's as Jeff said, so complicated. And now they're going back and looking at specialist providers, going to service providers to say, what can you now do? Whereas, 12, 18 months ago, it was yes, it's a nice to have, but, maybe we can build this ourselves.
And the point around the risk associated with data, I thought it was a good one, Jeff. That's something that we mentioned a lot of opportunities and the way to kind of best capture these, but there is obviously an element of risk there from a regulatory perspective, but even beyond that with cyber. And that's something, Lance, for instance, how do you deal with that? Is that something that you've been quite conscious over the recent years as data is becoming more and more important and you capture more and more of it, just making sure that it's actually not becoming a liability, that it remains an asset? Has that been on your mind as well?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about the comments here, right? I mean, what do, right? We are about underwriting risks in our investments, right? And making and providing returns to our investors. So that's our core. We'd love to continue just to be able to do this. All this other noise, sometimes we might think, becomes a little bit of pain, right? That's kind of how you initially view it. And then it's a matter of, okay, how much of that can get built into our risk management processes that we do for investments, and how do we as a firm then, and part of my job, right, is to take on a lot of the processes that maybe fall outside of that core investment sleeve of what we're trying to get done, and how do we integrate all that together. So these are important risks that we're aware of, that we talk about, that we build into our processes, that we need to make sure that we're complying with and doing. And so it's approaching it in like in anything, you think about an investment, how do we manage those risks that come up, and what are the best ways to manage those risks and make sure they don't have a larger impact on our investment than we want them to. And so it's the same process we're going through now as a firm, right? How do we manage each of these different risks, and how do we make sure that we're getting through them appropriately, and that we're managing the business to great returns for our investors. I think what Kartik brought up was, I think, extremely important. It's a little bit of a sales pitch for a service provider, but actually is valuable in the sense that I do feel as over time, the ability to have some third-party validation of what you're doing, even the fun admin side, the basics of how the business started, was, hey, is there a third independent party that can kind of take a look and make sure that these books and records are getting done properly, and the LPs get some comfort in that. So I do think that there's a lot of value that's being added by Apex and others out there to provide some of that validation. And I appreciate hearing that lens, because that's exactly what I want to have, right? Is not just someone who's collecting the data and shoving me the information, but it's actually taking it through a filter of their own expertise and saying, here's what you should be looking at. Here's the information that's valuable. Here's what we've done to ensure that it's accurate. and now here's the information that you can use with your investors and others. I think that is the partnership that we are trying to develop and lean on, because that provides that extra layer of security, that extra layer of validation for us to be able to feel confident in what we're doing and provide the information that's needed by our investor community, not just our limited partners, but regulators across the world as well.
Absolutely. And we've talked, value creation, we've talked ESG, we've talked data, the risk and the opportunities there. Are there any, have we left anything out? And are there kind of operational needs that you now see within private equity where service providers have really had to step in and help?
I can.
Sorry, go on.
So I can say one area where the industry needed to sort of join this century is around the processes. I think traditionally core administration is very manual, and you're talking about technology. It's all about digitalization. So what we're seeing is an expectation from managers and investors. That whole investor onboarding journey. The digitalization of that process. Removing the old sort of manual paper-based process, whether it's signing, an online subscription document or sending out documents through a more secure portal rather than the old way of emailing documents across. So I think, in some ways, this, our service providers do need to improve, start reinventing some of the old processes. And we definitely see a push from our clients and investors to move forward.
Yeah, still advantage that private equity is very keen on digitalization, but still works over a spreadsheet for tracking deals. Yeah. That's obviously a view of the past. Lance, how does that ring with you? And are there any other areas that we look at your operations and thinking, perhaps we could improve in this area, and then maybe kind of rely on a bit of support there as well?
No, I think you've moved a lot of your processes to some type of software solution and digitization. It's now, I think, what we talked about before. For me, it's more how do you tie in and integrate those systems together in a seamless way to aggregate the data that's valuable in making decisions, right? So you have data sitting in a lot of pockets within the firm and with our service providers in the case of Apex when they're doing fund admin services. It's so how do you then bring that that data together in a meaningful way? I don't think we're as spreadsheet based as we used to. I think that still becomes a lot of the time the analysis tool instead of a software solution.
It works.
But I do think that we've leaned on technology over the last decade that helps, at least in most of our processes, bring a little bit more technology to bear than we used to.
Yeah, totally. And Jeff, perhaps actually starting with you, because I'm very conscious of the time, and I know we've got a question coming up as well, and I think it will tie in with that final sort of parting thought. We've talked a lot about kind of the risk and sometimes the burden when that comes with regulation, but also the opportunities that are afforded to private equity climate. What's your take on, let's say, market in 6-12 months time? Are we dealing with what we're seeing now, these temporary hurdles, or do you think GPs need to realize that we're fundamentally in a different cycle now, and that sort of era? And you did mention sort of cheap debt, that's over. Any other kind of adjustments that you think the industry needs to make to kind of fully grasp that new cycle?
Yeah, so I do think we've come to the end of a cycle and we're beginning a new one. But that just means, I think, a bit of adaptation, really. I don't think it's revolutionary, but it is getting used to working. So interest rates will spike, inflation will spike. It's spiking very near double digits, but it will fall back. And if we have a recession, it might last 2 quarters, it might last 4, but then we'll come out the other side of it. There's a long history over decades and decades, indeed centuries, that would support that thesis. So I think we covered a lot of it, really. For me, it's being able to stay focused on deal making and value creation, which is the core purpose of private capital. It's proven its worth over the last 2-3 decades, I think, very consistently. So it will continue to get support from the LP base, the pension funds, the endowment funds, the university and municipal funds. I think there'll still be big investors in private equity, and they're very keen for return, because as demographics kind of slides toward an ever-aging population and a shrinking workforce, because the birth rate's falling in most developed countries. I think population replacement rates need a birth rate of about 2.2. Most developed countries are currently at 1.6. So you're going to have fewer people coming into the workforce if we take a sort of a big macro view, more elderly people needing support. So I think private equity firms, like most firms, need to seize technology, need to look at outsource models, because they just may not be able to get the people to do what they did. You know, there isn't that sort of ready supply of interns and people coming out of university or you know, with MBAs that perhaps there was in the past. So I do think technology is critical, because it's the only way you sustain productivity. So I think the core skills of private equity will just be applied to a different environment. I still think they'll be successful. Might be a bit less debt in the system, or we might be going for new sources of debt. But I do think we'll continue to add value. We'll learn how to reprice. That's probably a skill that many haven't had to have. So how do you explain through a portfolio company that your prices need to go up 10% or 15% instead of 3%? We'll kind of need to graft on skills like that. But that's where people like Lance add a huge amount of value to their portfolio companies, because they've got this depth and reservoir of experience, having done this many times in many different industries and situations, and you just build up that skill base. So I think that will carry on. I think the other thing that we need to watch out from, where again I think technology is largely the answer, is a much more complex regulatory world. We think it's complicated now, but it's going to get more complicated. We've just had to live with sanctions, and I think, you know, technology-based screening's been a very important part of keeping on top of that. And, you know, if you breach sanctions, it's a criminal thing, and it doesn't matter about the consequence of the value involved. You know, it's a very serious thing. So technology, to a degree, is one of our safeguards, where we can really apply sophisticated, try to do the proper screening, escalate if we find a problem, and deal with it. You know, that's keeping the firm on the road. So that's critical, I would say. In Europe, which I'm a bit closer to, increased requirement for disclosure, all these new sustainability reporting standards, the EU taxonomy, rules coming out now about disclosure and encouraging capital flows towards the green economy. That's more interventionist than I think we've seen before. There's a corporate sustainability directive on the way through. So I think the opportunity to work with whomever it is, you know, benchmark best practice to build a good compliant framework, set standards, measure progress, you know, capture and manage the data, is going to be mission critical to firms going forward. And you know, I think big strides have been made on that journey. Lance has explained some. I know one of the firms I work with, there's been a great deal of progress. There's a green team now in the firm, within the PE firm, within the investment manager, and they're taking it very, very seriously, producing annual sustainability reports now, not just for the GP and the overall situation, but for every single portfolio company, and then using the market leaders to educate the others as to how they can improve and pick up best practice. So I still think it's a fabulously attractive and dynamic industry to be involved with, but the coming period is going to be more complicated and a bit more demanding, I think, than the preceding period. But that isn't any reason why I don't think PE will continue to be very successful.
Excellent. And Lance, before I sort of ask you your take on the market in the next sort of six to 12 months, I'm going to put across a question, because I think you might have a view on that. That came through the chat, which is someone, hi, I was curious if the statement that returns are high after a recession would be dampened due to the rising cost of borrowing / sustained higher interest rates. Is that something that's coming into your equation when you see, you know, how successful the firm's going to be in the next part or so?
Jeff probably has more of a perspective on this if he sees more than I do, but again, we're going to manage those risks, right? And when you go into the face of those today, then you do different things to manage them. And so in many cases, it feels like you're able to come in, manage those risks. A lot of times you buy companies maybe a little bit better value during these type of environments. You're more aware of the ways to ensure that those things don't impact your investment returns in a meaningfully negative way. And so it just feels like you get back to the fundamentals sometimes, and you don't let the markets get carried away with valuation and pricing and multiple comparisons, and you end up leaning in more than you want to. So it just feels like overall the underwriting, even though you tell yourself we need to be consistent in our underwriting across all market segments, it just feels like in these environments you're able to get to, and it is probably because the other side of the table is more reasonable in actually acknowledging those risks in their business. And so you come to it just feels like a more reasonable starting point with your businesses, with the known risks on the table, with a very detailed valuation, a value creation plan that's been bought in by both yourself and the person across the table you're buying the business from. And so it just fundamentally feels like you're at a better starting point, and it just that ends up driving better returns, right? You're just fundamentals across the spectrum of how you underwrite a business has just been done in an environment where there's some more conservatism that can get built in, more what I might call cushion around your value creation plan on where the levers you can pull to drive value have more room for error built in than when you're trying to get top dollar in a very hot market on a pricing. You're just cutting to your returns a very thin margin on everything that you're executing on. And it feels like in these environments that you have multiple levers to pull, and one won't kind of kill the overall deal, where when it's in a hyper competitive environment, you're underwriting to such razor thin margins that any one thing can derail your project and your returns. And so it just feels like fundamentals are there, was the way I'd answer that question.
Yeah,
why returns are usually better out of a recession time.
And are you quite bullish on the next sort of year or so? How do you see the?
Yeah, I think we've always thought we because of our partnership approach to the marketplace, the long-term relationships, that we actually find real good opportunities during these times where where normal companies maybe not be coming to market. There is a slowdown in deals right now, and so you talk to investment banks, they may have 5 or 6 companies that they're just going to sit on for a while before they bring to market, because they don't want to bring to market in this environment. No one wants to be selling in this environment. But if you have differentiated sourcing, you have relationships with people, you're a partner, you can find ways to make investments in great businesses and help them along that path of why it's still a good time to sell a good portion of their business and how you can create value going forward. So you have to be able to come in and demonstrate that value to these sellers that are reluctant sellers at this time. And so I think it provides, and I think we're pretty bullish. We've got capital on sideline, as Jeff was saying earlier, like any other firm does. We've got capital to deploy, and we think we can do this in an environment. And so we think the next 12 to 18 months might help us differentiate ourselves amongst the broad group of private equity firms if we can really stick to our knitting and make the investments that we expect ourselves to make over the next 12 to 18 months, that we can demonstrate. And even the current investments that we have, that we've done that consistent underwriting in high quality businesses that hopefully will prove out even during these tougher market times. Fantastic.
And last but not least, Carty, busy times ahead for Apex next 12 months.
Yeah, we don't see a slowdown in the industry. I think it's a very resilient industry. That there's access to more funding as well. A lot of the platform providers making private equity or the alternative asset industry more accessible to sort of the high net worths, which means more and more money is flowing into the industry. And as I said, I think earlier, I think the single sort of continuations, the single vehicle managing a single asset, that those kind of structures, we're seeing more and more. There's definitely a trend towards those kind of vehicles as managers park investments, extract as much value as they can out of those businesses, but also enhancing liquidity for certain investors. And then I think the big one, what we're seeing as well, and given there might be some longer hold periods, is a lot of traditional closed-ended managers. I'd say closed-ended are moving towards an evergreen or an open-ended vehicle, and we're seeing more and more sort of managers coming to us asking us, how we can support them. Again, it's a technology play. The traditional technologies may not work for sort of open-ended as they do closed-ended, and vice versa. But what managers are looking to do is saying, well, we want to invest into a long-term asset, but our investors may be wanting enhanced liquidity options. So how do we combine the two? And we're seeing a lot more exotic options structuring around that. And that's where service providers, they view the market. They can actually help and support that process by looking at the wider market, what other managers are doing, what's the trends in the industry. So I think that's certainly one area that we're going to see significant growth.
Fantastic. Resilience and creativity. That sounds
Yes.
like a very good recipe for the next year or so. And before we get abruptly cut off by the end of the webinar, thank you very much for joining. Absolute pleasure to have you with us today. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed that. You'll be able to find the webinar on Real Deals in not too long, and it will be widely available for you to rewatch if you so wish. Thank you very much everyone, and pleasure to have you with us.